Today I'm excited to teach you how to make this beautiful, freshly milled sourdough bread in just one day, same day. So I decided to try this recipe for the first time. It was a snowy, beautiful winter day, perfect type of weather to bake something. So I had fed my sourdough starter the night before, and it looks nice and bubbly and ready to go. So this is the starter that I used, and just for full transparency, I use a sourdough starter that I had that is not fed with freshly milled flour. It's a 1-to-1 ratio of water and flour, regular flour. So I used about 75% white flour and 25% whole wheat flour. Now, what I'm doing is milling the hard white wheat berries. So, the recipe that I'm using is from Grains in Small Places, and the recipe calls for between 500 to 550 grams of flour. Now, I didn't know exactly how many cups that was going to be of the actual berries. So, it ended up being a little over 2 cups, I think between 2 to 2.5 cups or so to give me that sweet spot. So between 500 to 550 grams, I went with 512 grams. And the next thing I did is heated slightly to room temperature some water. So room temperature is usually between 68 to 77 degrees. I went a little on the warmer side because my house is a little bit chilly. You want 450 grams of room temperature water. So measure that out. Make sure that when you put your bowl on your scale, you clear that out to zero first, and then add your 450 grams of room temperature water. Next, I'm measuring out my sourdough starter. It calls for 115 grams of bubbly, freshly fed sourdough starter. Now, you can actually just add your sourdough starter to your bowl of water if you'd like, but I have a tendency to over pour, and it's a little more challenging to get out extra sourdough starter from your bowl of water, so I just measure it separately. So then you're just going to add your sourdough starter that was measured 115 grams ish or so, 115 ish, right? So I say ish because it could be, closer to 110. It could be a little, maybe closer to 120. It's pretty forgiving with sourdough. So as close to 115 as you can get it. So I'm just mixing that in to the water and just diluting it as much as possible. And next I'm adding all of the freshly milled flour. So again, in my case, I'm adding the 512 grams of milled flour. And by the way, I use my Como mill, which is a stone mill, to mill my flour. And I milled it on a fine setting. And now I'm just mixing the dough with a spatula. So I usually start with a spatula and try to get everything mixed in as much as I can initially. And then later I will resort to just using my hands. So just make sure that your hands are clean. And that way you can really get in there and make sure that any excess flour or flour that is still remaining, that's the light color, the dry flour that you see, you want to make sure that it's fully incorporated. And so I find that after using the spatula for a while, that just wetting my hands and going in to work with the dough with my hands works really well. So next I'm measuring out the salt, and this recipe calls for 12 grams of sea salt. I'm using real salt is what it's called. 12 grams of salt. And so I'm just adding that to the dough. And next, this recipe calls for vital wheat gluten, which just makes the texture better. in my opinion. Now, you don't necessarily have to use this. So, if you have gluten sensitivities and freshly milled flour works really well for your digestion, but you really want to avoid gluten, then you can just keep this step out. Now, I added it because I was just curious to see how it would turn out. I've used it a few times in some previous breads and it just helped with the structure. And I really liked it. I don't have any gluten intolerances or sensitivities. So I use this Anthony's Premium Vital Wheat Gluten. And I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check that out, if you want to start incorporating that into any of your breads. But here I use 20 grams of the Vital Wheat Gluten and just added that to the dough. And now I'm just mixing that in as well. And just working towards fully incorporating that into the dough. So here I'm going in with some wet hands and just giving it some good squishy tugs and just mixing it really well with my bare hands. Now I started this process around 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was done baking the bread by 2 p.m. So this whole process was pretty simple, and I was just amazed at how well it turned out. So I hope it works for you guys as well. So in this stage right now, after everything is getting mixed, you're going to notice that the dough is pretty tacky and kind of shaggy. That's normal. So what I'm doing now is wetting a tea towel and with warm temperature water and just wringing that out. And I'm going to cover the dough with a warm cloth and just let it sit for about 30 minutes or so. So I'm just setting my timer on my Fitbit for 30 minutes. And after the 30 minutes is up, that's when you're going to do your first set of what's called stretch and fold. If you've made sourdough before, you are familiar with this process, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But usually, what I do during that 30 minutes is I clean up my kitchen, I warm up my second cup of coffee, usually, or I'm warming up my same cup of coffee for the second time, is usually how it goes. And I just relax a bit, after I clean up the kitchen, light a candle, and just enjoy the morning. So the 30 minutes is now up, and now it is time to stretch the dough out and fold it. So I'll walk you through that process here. So I'm wetting my hands again because at this first stage, the dough is pretty tacky and kind of sticky. So this is just going to help prevent it from sticking to your hands. So I'm just scooping up the dough from the bottom because it's really sticking to the bowl. And then I'm just going to pull it as high as it will go without breaking it. Ideally, you don't want it to break, but you're going to notice that there's a tension. There's a point where you reach where it feels like it just can't stretch anymore. And you stretch it up, fold it over onto itself, and then do 1/4 turn. Pick it up from the bottom again, pull it up, stretching it up as far as it'll go, folding it onto itself, and then doing a 1/4 turn. You're going to continue doing this until it feels like you just can't fold it over enough. Now, some people only just do like 4 to 6 stretch and folds, and that's fine. I like to stretch it a bit more if I can. So, this first process, I believe I was stretching and folding for maybe, I don't know, a couple minutes or so until I couldn't stretch and fold it anymore. Now, the benefit of doing the stretch and folds is creating the tension so that the gluten really works its magic to create really good structure. So it's not so crumbly. And that's also what the vital wheat gluten helps with as well. It's just creating really beautiful structure in the bread. And it also helps to generate the beautiful air pockets that is so well known in sourdough. Now, full disclosure, this loaf of bread actually created a fairly tight crumb, meaning that there were not a lot of those big air pockets, which I actually prefer. I actually like a tighter crumb because I tend to like to put butter or peanut butter on it, and I just don't like it melting through. So here is just a picture of what the dough looks like after the first round. And you want to just kind of pay attention to the size of the dough because ideally, over the next 3 to 5 hours or so of this stretching and folding and letting it sit on the counter, you want it to get about 20 to 30% bigger. And so I just took a picture of it because I was thinking I'm not sure if I'm going to remember how big it was. So I just took a photo just to as a frame of reference. So now here I am going in for the second set of stretch and folds. And this was actually just about 25 minutes later. It wasn't quite 30 minutes. So you can also be pretty flexible in terms of your timing. I think that sometimes there's a reputation of sourdough, really needing a lot of babysitting. And yes, there are definitely steps that are helpful and to not skip over certain steps, but I don't necessarily like to be super dogmatic about having a very specific window of time that I do my stretch and folds. So make it work for you. So on this particular day when I baked this bread, I really intended and wanted to get outside and get some fresh air and walk out in nature with my dog. And so I made that happen. And I made that happen, while I was doing the sourdough and just making sure that making the sourdough was not going to be my number one priority. So anyway, you can fit it into your regular schedule. So here I am just getting outside in nature while my dough is sitting on my counter at my house. And my dog and I were enjoying the beautiful walk in the snow. So there's hardly anybody on the trail, which was awesome. My favorite time to be outside. And he's such a good sport. He loves the snow. So this is a perfect time for you to just get things done around the house or get some exercise, maybe go to the gym, do some laundry, do whatever you need to do for the day. Absolutely love days like this. So after about 45 minutes walking out in the wet snow, we were ready to come back home, and I poured myself a nice hot cup of warm tea, hot tea, I should say, a nice hot cup of hot tea. And I washed my hands and started my next set of stretch and folds. So this is probably closer to an hour or so later, maybe even a little bit longer than an hour since the last stretch and fold.
for a no sweat intro.
So you can see how smooth the dough is getting at this stage. And this was my last set of stretch and folds. I think I did a total of 4, if I'm not mistaken. Again, you can do more if you'd like. So if you're doing this every 30 minutes approximately for, between 2 to 5 hours, that's quite a bit more, which is probably going to create more air bubbles in the crumb of your loaf when it's fully baked. So, but again, just do whatever works for you. So this is what the dough looked like after a few hours, and I decided to place the dough in my oven with just the light on, so no heat, just the light, because I felt like it wasn't rising maybe high enough or fast enough. My kitchen was a little bit chilly that day, so I thought that might help it out a bit. And so now I'm actually just dusting a lined banneton, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, the bread basket that we use. And I'm using rice flour because it tends to be more fine. And I think it works a little bit better. But if you don't have rice flour, you can just use regular flour as well. And now what I'm doing is I'm just placing that dough on a clean, flat surface where I can begin to shape the dough. So right now, the first thing that I'm doing is I'm creating more of a rectangle shape. And I apologize that this particular portion is halfway off camera. So I'm going to do my best to describe to you what I'm doing here. So I'm shaping the dough flat and stretching it out into a rectangle. And then what I'm doing is I'm going to take a third of one side. So I'm going to start on the left side of the dough, and I'm just going to take and fold it about a third of the way. And then I'm going to fold the other side, the right side. I'm going to fold that over on top of the other fold. And then I'm just going to roll it tightly into a ball. And now if you can see that the seams are exposed on the side. And so right now what I'm doing is creating some tension by pulling the dough towards me. And so as it's rubbing across the surface, it's starting to create tension and it's starting to roll some of those seams underneath the dough. So the ultimate goal is to, at least for me, I like to use this method until I get those seams nice and clean and where you can't see them on the sides anymore. Now, you don't want to do this for too long per se, but usually, you can do a handful of these tugs and it will usually do the trick. Now, this recipe did not necessarily say that you rest the dough after this step on the counter before you place it into your basket, but that's just been kind of what I've been doing with all my other sourdough. So I just let it rest for 10 minutes on the counter. And then now I'm placing it in the basket, seam side up. So now you notice you can't even really see a seam. It's pretty clean. And next, I'm just placing it in a plastic bag. I'm just using a grocery plastic bag, and tying that up so that there is no air getting into that. Making sure that it has plenty of room on top. And then I'm just going to place it in my refrigerator. Now, this recipe calls for cold proofing. Is it called cold proofing or cold fermenting? I can't remember exactly the terminology, but basically you're putting it in the refrigerator between 1 hour to 3 hours, depending on how sour you want it. Now, because of timing, I had an appointment later that afternoon, so I was only going to place it in the refrigerator for 1 hour. So in the meantime, what I did is I started to preheat my Dutch oven, which is a brand new stove Dutch oven that my husband bought for me for Christmas, and it's amazing. Anyway, turn it up to 480. So you place it in your middle rack and make sure that your oven is cold when you first place your Dutch oven in the oven, and then heat it up to 480. So I actually turned the oven on and started preheating my Dutch oven as my dough was going to be in the refrigerator for the next hour. So after an hour, I took this dough out of the refrigerator, and now my Dutch oven is hot and ready to go, ready to bake. So now what I'm going to do is transfer this dough onto the silicone sling, which I think is so helpful. I've used parchment paper in the past, which is totally fine. You can use parchment paper. But I love these slings because it makes it so easy to place it in and out of, especially when the Dutch oven is really hot. It just makes it easier. Now, you notice that I dusted the bottom of the loaf. I hardly ever do that. I don't know why I did that this time. You don't need to do that, but I do recommend dusting the top of your loaf, and the reason being, if you're going to score your loaf, when you dust it with the flour, it just makes the contrast of the scoring pop, and it just looks beautiful. So you can see the scoring so much better when you have a nice, generous dusting of some type of flour on the top of your loaf. So I'm just using one of my favorite scoring methods, which is like a wheat design, and then the bigger, deeper score along the side. And the benefit of scoring is that as steam is created, especially in your Dutch oven when the lid is on, it's creating a lot of steam. It needs somewhere to escape. So if you don't score it, it's going to just release, and you might have just a really beautiful artisan, organic looking loaf of bread. But if you want it to be more controlled, then you can kind of play around with some beautiful scoring designs, which is kind of fun. So I just placed the silicone sling and the dough inside of my stove Dutch oven. And I'm going to place that back in the oven, and I'm not going to touch the temperature. The temperature stays at 480 degrees. And I'm going to set my timer for 35 minutes. Now, after 35 minutes, I'm going to remove my Dutch oven, and this is where I'm always so curious, like how is it going to look? What is it looking like? Is this turning out? So I'm dropping the temperature down to 450. So we're going to remove the lid, and I was so happy with how beautiful this loaf is looking. So I uncovered it, Took a look at the loaf. It's already turning really nice, beautiful golden. The scoring looks gorgeous. So next I'm just going to place it back in the oven, this time at 450 degrees with the lid off. And the recipe says to check it at around 20 to 25 minutes. I only placed it in the oven for an additional 10 minutes and it was already at 200 degrees. And I'm happy with 200-degree internal temperature. Generally for sourdough, you want it anywhere between 190 all the way up to 210. So I'm happy with 200 degrees, but just keep in mind that when I placed it back in the oven at 450 uncovered, it was only in there for 10 more minutes. So my recommendation is to just pay attention to how your bread is looking because it might bake a lot faster than you expect. And this is how it looks. I was so happy with it. I was just taking photos at every angle just to see which angle looked the best. And I was just so pleased with how beautiful this bread turned out. Isn't it so pretty? I'm so happy that I found this great recipe. So I hope this is really helpful for you as well. So after cutting it open, you can see that the crumb is more on the tighter side. That's my dog Jax. He's smelling the yummy, yummy, yummy bread. And I gave a half a slice to my husband and he tasted it and he's like, "Oh, this is really mild. It doesn't taste like sourdough at all." And I think that's because, and he really liked it, but he just noticed that there was no sour flavor at all. And I think it's because I only had it in the fridge for 1 hour. If you want it more sour, leave it in for up to 3 hours. I'm going to try it next time for 3 hours and see what the taste is like. I hope you enjoy this bread.